Hello everyone, and welcome to Let's Talk After the Show.
No! No! No!
In this episode, we'll be going over everything regarding ModGear Season 2, how the show originally became to be, the entire development process, and what's next in ModGear's future. We have a lot to talk about today, so without further ado, let's discuss what you need to know after the show about ModGear Season 2. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that this episode is divided into 5 different categories, because there's a lot to talk about. This is divided in early development, late development, episode development, cut content, and of course, what's next. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's get to this episode. Let's begin with ModGear's early development in Season 2. Where did the show originally begin development, and just how did it start development? Originally, Season 2 began development pretty much immediately after Season 1, so the first few weeks after Season 1 had ended in July, so probably you're looking at late August, maybe early September at the latest, as to when Season 2 originally began its development. Some of the early design plans for Season 2 included that the show was going to stay relatively the same, with similar tests and similar just content as a whole, but there also was going to be new ideas thrown in, and this is where things like history lessons, custom bits, changes to the Forksville, the cornering circuit, and as well as the slalom test. These ideas were thrown in just to kind of give ModGear, a fresh breather. Surprisingly enough, ModGear actually wasn't planned to air in February on Valentine's Day. Instead, the show was originally planned with a planned air date of January 3rd, the first Friday of the year basically, and was actually planned to be teased via teaser trailers as well as official trailers starting from September of 2019. Meaning that ModGear base would have been teased for about 4 months leading up to its launch. So there was definitely especially back then, there was definitely a time when I wanted to continue YouTube because again, I took that 4-month break after Season 1 ended. It was very much clear that I still wanted to make videos because ModGear was planned to be teased throughout the entire time. But unfortunately this didn't end up happening, and ModGear ended up airing on Valentine's Day rather than January 3rd because of just development time. One of the things that did change in early development was that in Season 2 we had custom bits, or custom challenges I like to call them. Basically challenges that pertain to specific cars that are very unique in some way, to the car's strengths. Whether this be cornering, top speed, brakes, something related to its strengths that unify it in its custom bit. And while Season 1 technically had some form of custom bits to an extent, like in Episode 3 with the police chase, or maybe episode, I can't remember which episode, Down the 177, with the James Bond Act, you can get the idea that Season 1 definitely had some custom bits, but they weren't really considered custom bits. Instead, in ModGear's early development, Season 2 was planned to make custom bits just a normal thing and have them once per episode, and they all needed to be unique to some extent, whether this be both in the car's history or something that the car was exceeded well in. You're probably wondering, well then what about history lessons, because they had to come in somewhere. It turns out, if you've seen Let's Talk with ModGear Season 1, you'll probably know of ModGear The Lost Season, a series of 5 episodes that was originally supposed to be 10 episodes, and was supposed to be what Season 1 ended up becoming before Season 1 actually, went live and all that. History lessons actually come from ModGear The Lost Season. The Lost Season actually ended up having its own kind of rendition of short history segments. Bear in mind, they were really short. If you've seen, the ModGear special Widow to the Maker from this season, think of that short, but cut it in half. They were really short. One of the other things in ModGear's early development was that it was planned that the show would have its own intro. Season 1 kind of had its own intros, but it relied on the show's main footage, so it just teased it. I didn't really like that intro idea, so I wanted to have ModGear have its own intro, one that was always the same. And so this intro idea came from, surprise enough, the old channel intro. If you've been with the channel long enough, you probably know this particular intro. Roll the clip. And I basically wanted to make ModGear feel like a real series, so to it have its own intro just kinda made sense. And lastly, for the early development, Season 2 was mainly just focused on making Season 1 better, and making what I believe it should have been. I feel Season 1 could have been a lot better, and Season 2 is definitely helping make that better and make that dream come alive. And with our first segment out of the way, we can now get to the next segment, which is ModGear's late development. And what do I mean by late development? What I mean by that is basically in the last 30 days before ModGear actually aired. So right around January 13th leading up to Valentine's Day. During that time period, what was getting finalized in ModGear's development? During the last month before ModGear's launch, only really a few minor things actually ended up getting developed. One of the bigger things was that the 20 to 30 minute restriction, which if you know what that means, it basically just means that ModGear episodes cannot be lower or shorter than 20 minutes, but they cannot be longer than 30 minutes, basically just making it like a normal TV-like episode because you get the idea. But this restriction was put into place sometime in ModGear's last month before its launch, simply because as I was testing footage and just kind of seeing what the show would end up becoming, the episodes were just being a lot short, or very short I should say. I don't know why I was saying a lot there. But they were coming out to be very short, like 15 to 16 minutes, and I didn't want that. I wanted it to be like an actual TV series, and applying that restriction definitely helped make that work. Another thing that also got finalized around this time was the idea of the ModGear special. This was basically when ModGear's episode cap got increased a little bit, as to, incorporate more episodes in this case, and the ModGear special was an idea that I wanted to incorporate, and this ended up getting basically thought up in the idea of, okay, we're going to do it at some point. It ended up getting brought into my attention the last month before launch. Around this time, just the show's intro had been made completely, and things like modding and maps and just video structure as a whole was getting pretty hard tested around this time period, but aside from these things, late development was mainly just finishing up the show and getting it ready for its launch. And now we can move on to episode development. This will basically just explain things as to how each episode was developed more in depth. But for these episodes, I'm really just going to focus on why I chose these specific cars, how the custom it's played out, and if there's anything I would do differently. So let's begin by starting with episode 1, and that is with the Toyota Supra. I originally chose the Supra just because it's from Fast and Furious, and I figured it's a good car to at least start a season with. And the custom bit, I would say, for episode 1 definitely lacked. I felt like there could have been a lot more with that episode done, as it just felt very short, as it was actually the only episode pretty much in the entire season that was under the 20-minute restriction. So I definitely feel that this episode could have been longer. I definitely felt like there could have been a lot more in its custom bit as far as just life, and I really wish this episode could have gone a lot better. Moving into episode 2, which is, I believe it's called Godzilla's Tiny Cousin, with the Skyline R34 GTR. I definitely do feel this was a very good choice, and especially coming out of a very crappy episode, episode 2's custom bit definitely did feel a lot better. Incorporating an idea of, a mass attack with Godzilla and all that, I definitely feel like it was very fluent, I felt like it was very funny, and I felt like it was enjoyable. I really did enjoy episode 2 and its custom bit, as well as just the test with the Skyline itself. I think the Skyline did pretty well in a lot of its tests. So a very good episode with this one. Moving on to episode 3, I had chosen the RX-7 just more because of its engine, that being that it's a rotary and it has a triangle, a Dorito as its engine basically, and I wanted to see how well this car can perform in certain tests, and just kind of see what kind of custom bit I could throw at it. The custom bit I did throw at it just wasn't really, it was okay, but it just didn't really feel right. I felt like it could have been a bit longer, I felt like there could have been a bit more thrown into it, but regardless of what I did, it still ended up coming out pretty good. But I definitely feel like there could have been like 1 or 2 things I could have changed, just very minor details that wouldn't really been noticed, but it still came out pretty good. Moving on to episode 4, patient number 350Z. And the 350Z just, it was okay. It was a bit slow, its oversteer was a bit over there, I guess you could say. I think the one thing that struggled about this episode was its custom bit, and the fact that I think it was just way too long. I feel that the custom bit that I gave the 350Z just felt a little too long, and I think it was just getting over-exaggerated with the idea of just making it like a zombie-like custom bit, and I felt like I could have made it a lot shorter. So I think that's really the only thing I would change with this custom bit for episode 4 is I would just make it shorter, because I felt like it was just way too long. And moving on to episode 5, and one of my personal favorites, the Tofu Machine with the Toyota AE86. I definitely felt that doing a Mount Akina styled kind of custom bit was definitely something that just fit the car and it fit its personality. And I really do think that episode 5 came out to be very well, and also incorporating car sounds using narration and whatnot into the video itself really made this custom bit come alive. And I think out of all the custom bits this season, it's one of the best. And just besides that, the A86 did really well on tests, and it just surprised me by how fast it was for a little hatchback. But I think this custom bit was very well. I think this episode was really solid, and I'd love to do something like that again. Moving on to episode 6, it's a Jag. And this custom bit, and especially this car, was kinda debatable. I've always been a fan of the Jaguar F-Type. If you've seen my old Garry's Mod videos, you'll probably understand why. But that's mostly just because I've just enjoyed this car pretty much all the time, and it's one of my dream cars back in the day. But the custom bit this episode had just definitely lacked. I feel there could have been a lot more done with this episode, and I felt like there could have been at least some kind of other direction it could have gone in, because I feel like it was just very lackluster. I didn't think it was enjoyable, but it still was enjoyable to an extent. It just wasn't as enjoyable as, say, like Tofu Machine or Godzilla's Tiny Cousin. But I definitely would like to see this custom bit maybe down the line, maybe get revised or redone in some kind of way, maybe with like a different car or a similar car, but just not follow the same story, because I feel like this custom bit definitely just did not nail the bar. And moving on to episode 7, G to the T, this was actually probably one of my more favorite custom bits, as the custom bit for this one was based off the Ford vs. Ferrari movie, which I think was actually a really good choice, since it just worked. I think it just worked with this car's heritage. And altogether, using the maps and using more car sounds again, and just making it seem like it was real and all that, really made this custom bit feel good. And altogether, the Ford GT was actually a really well-performing car. It scored a number of awards in the ModGear Awards in Season Recap, which if you haven't seen that, make sure you go check that out from last week. But I think custom bit and just this car as a whole really did well, and I'd love to try to do another custom bit like this again in the future. And now that we're reaching basically the season half point, I can discuss about the development on the ModGear Special. My first thoughts going into ModGear Special was I wanted to make it feel kind of like the Grand Tour specials or Top Gear specials in a way, getting from point A to point B. Like, for example, if you've seen Grand Tour, one of the Grand Tour episodes, they got plopped into a desert and they had to get to a town called Moron while building themselves basically like a vehicle. Get from point A to point B while just incorporating other things in between. And that's basically what the ModGear Special's kind of background was like, getting from some random place in the desert back to ModGear HQ in Forksville, while basically incorporating all of the major ModGear challenges into it in some kind of way, but not actually explicitly saying that it's like, here's the cornering test. Altogether, I think the ModGear Special actually came out a little bit short, I think just kind of in the way it was designed, but even then, I still enjoyed it. It came out pretty well and better than I expected, and I think I really love it as a very good first attempt at a special-like episode. But anyway, let's get back into it with episode 8. And, well, episode 8 definitely had some very interesting changes. For one, this episode was not actually meant to be called whatever it was called. I actually can't remember what it was called. I think it was called The Lost Raging Bull originally or something, and it ended up not happening. But originally it was supposed to have a completely different name, and it just ended up getting that name because of, well, you know, story. But altogether, this car performed better than I expected during the tests, and its custom bit's probably one of my personal favorites, being in an arena, and you have the Urus down there. It was probably one of my personal favorite custom bits out of this season, definitely in my top 3, and I would definitely love to try to find another car similar with its story, or possibly try to do another custom bit similar to it. Moving on to episode 9 with the Subaru WRX STI. I definitely felt this episode definitely just kind of fell behind in its custom bit, as using Trackmania and another police chase just felt kind of boring. I felt like police chases just kind of, they were over-drowned basically. There was too many of them at that point, and it just felt wrong. Especially because the episode just didn't feel right at all. The custom bit just kind of lacked a bit. The WRX did win multiple awards in the ModGear Awards, but even then, like, the custom bit just didn't nail the bar. Moving on to episode 10, the Swedish God with the Koenigsegg CCX. As I've mentioned in the ModGear Awards, this car definitely surprised me. It surprised me in a lot of ways, both from its speed, its tremendously slippery cornering, and all in all, I figured that it needed to deserve a very top speedy, like drag test for a custom bit, just to show how quick it was. And altogether, I think custom bit for episode 10 came out pretty well. There's definitely some changes I could have made, maybe like add more crowds or more cars or something, but I feel like for what it came out to be, it ended up coming out pretty good. Moving on to episode 11 with the Pagani Zonda Cinque Roadster, I definitely felt this custom bit also didn't necessarily hit the bar that right either. And while it was based once again, it was one of the last few police chases that this show actually had, I just felt like its ending didn't really work that well. You know, getting to a restaurant and dodging stuff, it just didn't really work. I mean, it kind of worked, but it just didn't work completely as I intended. And that's kind of why I'm not really a fan of episode 11. Plus, the car just didn't really perform that well in tests really either. So, while it's not a bad episode, and while it's not a bad custom bit by no means, it definitely didn't nail the bar, and I would highly try to improve things, maybe like, you know, just minor testing features. Moving on to episode 12, right down to Alpine, with the Alpine A110. And honestly, this car kind of really shocked me, honestly. Even for being how slow it is, it definitely did well in corners, it did well in rallying, and it was just a nice little car, and I enjoyed it. But I figured that I needed to get some kind of rally test in, since episode 9 wasn't really a rally test, because, again, episode 9 was supposed to be a rally-based custom bit, and it ended up really not happening. So I figured, okay, let's do this again with the Alpine, give it an actual proper rally test. And so this was kind of the idea, using the Somerset map. You know, we called up Somerset, said, hey, we need to borrow this. And I think it ended up coming out pretty well, but being that I had to, you know, swap to different cars and stuff and whatnot, I felt like it could have been a bit better. I felt like that there could have been some things that could have been changed, some things that could have been went out a bit smoother. But even though, besides that, it's still a good custom bit, the car did really well in tests, and I'm happy that the episode came out good. Moving on to episode 13, Living with a McLaren. This episode was very fun to make, I'll give that credit. The McLaren did very well in a lot of the tests that I put it through, and all in all, it's just one of my personal favorite cars, pretty much not just in the show, but one of my favorite cars, period. The custom bit for this episode was more or less based on an episode from Car Throttle. It's not necessarily the exact car in this case, because they did it with a 570S, but in their video, they basically just said, okay, how can you live with a McLaren 570S? Can you, go shopping with it? Can you do all this other stuff with it? That was basically my goal with the 12C, was to recreate it to an extent. And I think it actually went pretty well. I think the custom bit itself went really smoothly, and I personally enjoyed it. And I'd love to try to do something again like that later down the line. Moving on to episode 14, Are You Porsche? And the name for this episode was really weird because it's supposed to be like, Are You For Sure? And it didn't really come out properly, but it's a name, let's roll with it. This episode, I feel, was kind of, sort of like episode 1 in a way. The episode had gotten like over 20 minutes, I think, at this point, before even Custom Made had gotten actually properly made. And Custom Made, I think, ended up falling really short, being only like less than 3 minutes. I think Custom Made was really short, but it still provided a lot of, I guess, humor and fun. But I think the biggest thing I would change with this particular custom bit is to just make it longer. Make it a bit longer, throw in a bit more humor, and throw in a bit more character to this episode, because I felt like it just didn't have it. And finally, moving on to episode 15, Fastest in the World. When it came to actually testing the Bugatti, it was really fun. I mean, did you see that Nissan Leaf fly in the air? Let's be honest. But when it came to creating the custom bit, I figured, let's try something different, let's try something unique. We ended up using the Genesis Dragway, and it had James come over. We did some like computer hacking kind of coding just to show our speed, because I figured, let's try something different. Let's try something that hasn't really been done on the channel before. I think episode 15's custom bit came out to be pretty good, and I really like the conclusion to what is basically the end of a normal ModGear episode. But yeah, that basically just confirms all of the episode development, why cars were chosen, an explanation, God, I can't speak, an explanation of all the custom bits, as well as the ModGear development for the ModGear special. And I think, all in all, episodes this season went out pretty well. There is a few things I would change in some of the episodes, and maybe some major design changes, like making things longer, making something short, just throwing in other things, because again, some of them didn't come out that great. But aside from this, I think episodes came out pretty well this season. And now we can move on to probably one of the more interesting aspects of this episode, and that is the cut content from Season 2. Content that was either cut or scrapped either during or after the production of the show, or even before the show, that just really wouldn't work with the show, either by postponing its launch, or just would take way too much time and make the show even harder to make. The first piece of cut content was more or less before the show actually ended up getting production, and you can probably already see it, and that is the original cornering test. If you remember back from Season 1, there really wasn't much of a cornering test. It was more just driving around Forksville and just, saying it was a cornering test. And because that was really just a bad example of it, the cornering test ended up getting a completely fresh redesign for Season 2, and is now being used as the Forksville test circuit to represent the cornering test. And I think this was a much needed change. Some of the other bits of cut content and stuff was just some minor changes to certain tests, but many of these minor changes actually ended up going into effect, but some of them ended up not going into effect because, again, they would just kind of, make things weird. But now I get to probably the 4 biggest ones. The 4 pieces of cut content that basically aren't in the show basically at all. And the first one I want to touch on is the idea of the ModGear Festival. Originally, Season 2 was planned to be a lot more open world. If you've played games like Forza Horizon or Need for Speed, for example, you'll probably be familiar with festival hub points. Places where, people can go, change out their cars, upgrade their cars, do stuff like that. And that was basically what ModGear was planned to have. A central festival location, probably located somewhere maybe like in Forksville or something, where people could just come, upgrade their cars, and explore the round. Unfortunately, this ended up getting scrapped for a number of reasons. The first was simply just of how much work it was going to have to be, as trying to incorporate a festival with a lot of cars and stuff all around the map, it just wasn't going to work because of how much time and effort it was going to have to take to make it seem legitimate. And second, the assets for many of the ideas that I wanted just wasn't there. And I figured that if I didn't have the assets, then what's the point of even trying? And speaking of this, there was also the idea of incorporating a ModGear festival, but having multiple different outposts. Similar to that, again, how Forza Horizon, like the original one, and even now, in the current Forza Horizon, you have different houses in different parts of the map, which represent as outposts in this case. ModGear was planned to have something similar, maybe having one in the city of Freeland, one in Somerset, one in Forksville, and stuff like that. Basically places that people can go and fast travel to or something. But this idea ended up getting scrapped because the ModGear Festival idea basically got cut and scrapped pretty much completely. Another idea that was actually supposed to be what the custom bits was at least planned to be, and this was the idea of Star Showdowns. Basically, Star Showdowns were the first actual real idea, basically the beta version of custom bits. Star Showdowns basically worked something like this. Let's say you had like a Lamborghini Huracan, and you're driving that around the festival. The way Star Showdowns work is it takes your car and pairs it up with either one or two of that car's most well-known rivals. So like a Ferrari 488 GTB, for example, as a rival to the Lamborghini Huracan. Then those two cars, or maybe a third, depending on how many rivals there are, they basically race each other from point A to point B, whether it's be from like an outpost to an outpost, or like an outpost to like a certain point in the desert, something like that. And the winner would basically get a giant cash reward, and the cars would end up going back to the festival and no longer being able to be driven or something. That was basically the first design for Star Showdowns, but because there just wasn't really a lot of time, and because a lot of the cars that were planned to actually be rivals to the cars that were in this season just weren't in the Steam Workshop. So I figured if the cars weren't there, if there wasn't enough time, and because the ModGear Festival didn't really exist at that point, there wasn't really a point to even bring it in the first place. So it ended up getting scrapped, and custom bits is what ended up coming out of it instead. So think of it like you wouldn't have custom bits, because Star Showdowns probably would have been what custom bits are right now. And finally, the last piece of cut content from Season 2 is the idea of what I'm calling rival support. Basically, as I've mentioned many of times, I myself am a solo content creator, and ModGear is based completely off me, because again, I have a very big imagination, let's put it that way. Rival support was basically saying that ModGear was not going to be a solo-made series. It was made to be having more people coming in to help develop the show and make it more of a community-wide project. But unfortunately, due to just people, rival support didn't end up coming into play whatsoever, and it was ended up getting scrapped pretty early on in ModGear's development. But anyway, now we get to the more interesting part of this episode, and that is, what's next for ModGear? It's a very interesting question because I personally myself don't really know what's going to be next for ModGear. However, what I will say is, if you've seen season recap, at least the most current one aired on June 5th, then let me play this clip for you real quick.
Listen.
Is something wrong, James?
ModGear isn't going to be the same after this season ends.
What? Don't be screwing with me, James. Oh, wait. You're not joking.
No, I'm not. Back in 2013, I went up to Colorado for vacation. I discovered this racing festival, with event showdowns, and hundreds of cars. And I want to bring it to ModGear.
James, what was this festival actually like, anyway?
Amazing. I think it was called Horizon. Oh man, look at the time. I'm heading home. Take care of yourself, kid.
I'll go ahead and restate James' quote from season recap, as in case you know. ModGear isn't going to be the same after this season ends. And bear that in mind. There's a lot of ideas that I've already thought about for season 3, as pretty much if you've seen season recap and you've seen that final shot, it's basically confirmed that season 3 has a pretty high chance of actually happening and going into production at some point. So most likely season 3 will end up happening. And as James says in season recap, season 3 is not going to be the same, or basically nowhere near the same, as season 2 or season 1. Most likely ModGear's formula, I would say, would probably stay the same during season 3, but there is going to be some very big changes coming and some stuff that I wanted to test out. But just be aware that things like the 20 to 30 minute restriction are still going to be active during season 3, and many of the things that have been brought into season 2 are going to be brought into season 3, like the idea of a ModGear special, the idea of a show's own intro, and stuff like that. They're all going to be brought into season 3. But most likely, a lot of things are going to be changing in Season 3. One of the biggest things that's probably going to change is the idea between history lessons and custom bits. Most likely, history lessons will probably stay around for ModGear pretty much until whenever it ends, as I feel history lessons are basically a really good idea for ModGear, and they work with the show really well, so most likely they won't ever actually get scrapped. However, it is currently already planned that custom bits will not be returning in Season 3, and they plan on being replaced with something else just for a single season. Say hypothetically ModGear, I don't know, gets a 4th season or something, custom bits would end up returning pretty much after that full time, and they wouldn't be, getting deleted or something. So in that case, when is the soonest that ModGear Season 3, which it's still unknown if it'll happen or not, but most likely it will, when's the soonest release date it can happen? Well, let me go ahead and get it out of the way. ModGear Season 3 will not be premiering any time for the remainder of 2020, and that's just more because A, the summer's already been filled out with a bunch of content, which you'll see in Pandaren Update, which goes out next week, and because the 4th quarter of the year has already been taken up by EXE files, so I'm not going to go ahead and make it premiere midway through. Most likely Season 3 will premiere sometime in 2021, it's unknown exactly when, but most likely it will not be premiering in 1st quarter or 4th quarter of 2021, as I feel that for 4th quarter it's just too late, and especially during 1st quarter, due to things like schoolwork and all that, it's just not going to work. As since next year I'll be starting my 2nd to last year in high school, and things like ACT tests are just going to get completely crazy, and I don't want ModGear premiering midway through it, because I don't want to screw up ModGear's production value, and I don't want to really make any episodes feel like they're absolute crap. So most likely ModGear wouldn't premiere till a month or 2 after the school year or before the school year ends. So sometime between 2nd or 3rd quarter 2021 is probably the soonest that you're going to see Season 3 actually being, live. But anyway, that basically is a wrap. So to recap, let's just go over what we went over. We went over basically all of ModGear's early development, how the show originally started, and just kind of getting the baselines as to what we were going to be expecting from Season 2. We also went over some of the late development stuff that was going on the last month before the show's launch. We also went over things like episode development, as discussing how each individual episode was made and some of my own personal thoughts on each one. And lastly, we also went over some of the cut content both before, during, and after production of Season 2. Stuff that was originally planned to air during the show and things that were planned to be implemented, but didn't end up getting implemented due to a number of reasons or just one reason. And lastly, we also discussed ModGear's future, as most likely, there's a very high chance, probably like a 90% chance I would say, that Season 3 will most likely happen, and that it's basically just a very long time out before Season 3 actually does happen, and that, I'll restate James's quote one more time, ModGear isn't going to be the same after this season ends. Just bear that in mind. But anyway, that is going to conclude this Let's Talk after the show. If you've enjoyed ModGear and you want to see more, make sure you comment down below in this video and as well as many other ModGear episodes on what you guys thought of the show. And continue to stay updated on the show because again, it's not like ModGear will ever come back again because again, it's very likely that ModGear will return. It's just going to take a while. Anyway, that's going to conclude this episode. My name is PandaPowerSauce. Remember to stay saucy, and thank you for watching Let's Talk after the show. We'll see you next week. Good night.